So here we are. It's Len and the Virginia Show.
Good afternoon, everybody.
So what we thought we would do, we really got tired of listening to all of these podcasts from experts. So we thought that we would do a podcast from the front line.
The inexperts.
The inexperts. The people who go out there and put their life on the line for the betterment of people. Well, maybe that's an overstatement. What do you think?
Well, I think we're talking about the people that are out working every day. Sometimes they're in facilities, sometimes they're in the community, anywhere, but just going to work every day.
Is that us or them?
Well, it's both of us and them, I think.
I think so too. And going to work for me means going a number of different places and seeing people in all sorts of circumstances. I'm one of these people who does crisis work, so I end up in, the oil patch, out on a rig, where somebody has been unfortunate enough to have lost their life or injured themselves. And so I go up and work with people who survive that. Or I may be downtown working with an organization that's going through downsizing, or in terrible circumstances, I may be with an organization who's about to terminate an employee, and I'm there to support the employee. Over and above that, of course, I have an office practice. How about you?
Well, I'm a community mental health therapist, so I see people in their town where they live and the outlying communities. I see children, I see their parents, I see adults, and I too have a private practice, independent practice. I work with veterans from the military. I mostly see them in their homes, sometimes in the community. In addition to which, I'm of an age where I still have elderly parents and I have adult children, and I'm experiencing firsthand what it's like to see the decline of one, possibly both of my parents as they move forward into their elder years. And there's some grief and loss I'm experiencing while they're still alive.
Well, and I've gone through that grief and loss, having lost both of my parents, and just recently having lost a colleague of mine, a fellow I've practiced across the hall from for 15 years. And as we talk about our areas of practice, one of the things that is really evident is that almost everything that we do has an element of grief and loss in it. And one of the things that I find very difficult in all of the interventions I've done with outside organizations and within my own practice is that we know nothing about grief and loss. We're not taught it in schools or in university. The average master's program probably has an hour of grief and loss work before you graduate. Nursing tends to have very little grief and loss work, and yet it's grief and loss all the time. When we talk about children's services, it's another area where grief and loss predominates. Every time they move, they're talking about the death of some form of family. And so I think grief and loss could be our first topic. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I'm nodding, even though the listeners can't see that. But certainly in the community mental health world, grief and loss permeates majority of the clients we see, and yet it's not recognized as a diagnosis that we can treat first line. It's not included in our diagnostics, and yet to treat somebody from a holistic perspective, seeing them as the whole person they are when they walk through the door, I think it's important sometimes to honor the losses, the grief they might be experiencing. And it can range from a long continuum of losses, from the death of someone.
So when we talk about that, it opens up a whole new framework for me. First of all, one of the areas that I get really concerned about is the whole disenfranchised grief component that as North American societies we embrace all the time, that being death of a pet. One of the most difficult losses that we face. I know that in my work, one of the things that I've looked at is the beneficial impact of programs like the Rainbow Bridge. I mean, the Rainbow Bridge, I'm not sure how often it's accessed on the internet, but the whole concept of having a place where you're going to rejoin a lost loved pet has such a therapeutic impact on people. The other thing that you mentioned that really sort of triggered me was the continuum of grief and loss. And it took me instantly to the grief and loss that we experienced when I, in particular, worked with some of the people who went through the whole Fort McMurray fire experience. And I had a difficult time with this concept because I was trying to think of a method of teaching this to others, how we look at the continuum of grief and loss from minor grief, I'm not going to be able to run the mile in under 4, to major loss. I've lost friends and family and home. And how do we talk about that with other colleagues in our professions? Because if we say, well, what we're dealing with is a death, we never talk about the context that we put that death in. And the context carries all of the weight or all of the beauty, if you will, of that terrible experience. And so when we deal with that, I'm hoping that we can talk about, either today or in the future, the concept of companioning. I was fortunate enough to take some programs from Alan Wolfelt. And in fact, on my website, you may notice the Black Ribbon program. That was developed after Wolfelt challenged me by saying that we didn't need death symbols, that they wouldn't be accepted by society. And so I went back to Edmonton and developed the Black Ribbon and the card that goes with it, and produced 100 of them, and they were gone within a day. And now I notice on his website that he has his equivalent of a death symbol. And I think good on you. That's exactly what we need. We need to bring grief and loss into the conversation, because when it's in the conversation, we can explore things like, what is the context of the loss and how does that add depth to that experience? And what can we do as people, in Wolfelt's words, who are walking with you through that experience? What can we do to be of service to you?
And one of the things that you triggered for me was that oftentimes the people around the person who is grieving are anxious because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to help. It seems that over time we've lost some of the normalcy, if you will, on grieving. I think about growing up in a community where still to this day it's a small town, but when someone loses somebody, the community gathers together regardless of what their spiritual practice is, but the door bell keeps ringing, and there are people standing with offers of flowers and cards and gifts of food and time to just sit with the family who is going through the loss.
I think that one of the things that has been really profound for me is that in the 15 years that I've done this work, when I've gone out to corporations, there is a significant percentage of them who ask me what it is they should do. And that really surprises me. It surprises me that they don't have some sort of policy or procedure. But it also surprises me that the old customs of the tuna casserole and the friendly visitor seem to have fallen away. And my experience is that people who are grieving appear to frighten away people who would be natural supporters. We seem to be afraid of the intense emotions. Anxiety? Yeah, I think that anxiety is another topic in and of itself, because everybody that comes into my office claims to be anxious.
And not only are they claiming to be anxious, but lots of people come in and they're not even aware that they're anxious, is something I'm seeing more and more of. And in younger and younger children.
It fascinates me, too, that we have programs like the heart rate variability program that our government is sponsoring through Alberta Health Services, where that isn't being widely used, not only within the community, but more importantly, within the medical profession. Nurses and doctors are unaware of it. They know the concept of heart rate variability, but they aren't aware of the psychological benefits, or even in some cases the physiological benefits. But back to grief and loss. When we use the companioning model, it allows us to find out from the person what the experience of grief and loss is. And I'm not sure that we should be intervening at all unless we go through that step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The importance of doing what's important to the person to practice intentionally is of paramount importance to me. I don't think that practice is ethical unless we do that.
It's almost like a bearing witness in some ways, being present for that person.
One of the important aspects of it is being present. And again, I think that that's something with the advent of iPads and telephones that we've lost. No longer do we know how to be present as people. And it breaks my heart that as clinicians, as counselors, that we have to be trained in how to respond in a being present fashion.
Mm-hmm. The mindfulness movement.
The mindfulness movement. Yeah. Absolutely.
But you're also bringing up a really important point, too, and that is that those of us, and many like us, who are there working, being present, bearing witness to folks in their times of difficulty, are also experiencing some challenges and emotional impact just by virtue of being present. We call it compassion fatigue. We call it burnout. The symptoms are not easily recognized by ourselves, but become apparent to those around us.
You know, it was funny, not funny, funny, unusual in Fort McMurray that when I was up there, and I was up there for about a year and a half, 2 to 3 days a week, one of the topics that we were asked, my colleague and I, Angela Stimson and I, were asked most often to speak about was compassion fatigue. And who did we speak about that to? Nurses, public health officials, people who I would have thought would have been trained about it. And so our assumptions about context went out the window, and we had to start at square one. I think that that's, on one side, really tragic. But on another side, it's an opportunity for us as counselors to use psychoeducation and take it to the community so that there is some development of knowledge. I'm fortunate. I'm an affiliate member of the Alberta Funeral Service Association, and I take great pride in that membership because it allows me to open conversations that wouldn't otherwise open to me.
True enough.
You know, and in the future, we're moving into an age where death is going to be such a common experience as our baby boomer parents or grandparents die, that we're going to need this knowledge. We're going to need to look at compassion fatigue, not only for those that we're serving, but also for ourselves. Which brings me to another topic that I really get annoyed about when I talk about grief and loss, and that is self-care in the clinician.
Mm-hmm.
This one really bothers me, so I'm going to put it out there. I was deployed up to McMurray after the wildfire, and as I was driving up, I was asked by the people who deployed me whether or not it would be appropriate for a person who had just lost his house, a clinician who had just lost his house, to be one of the clinicians up there working with others. I'm sorry. I don't think that person should have been anywhere except in an area where he could receive care.
That's right.
Whether he believed he needed it or not, care at that moment for him would have been my highest priority, because everything or anything could trigger him.
Mm-hmm.
I went up to McMurray. I drove against the evacuees heading up to Fort McMurray the night of the evacuation, because I had been asked to work with the wildfire team. And after getting to McMurray and coming out and then going back again, having to drive through the burnt lands and the smell of the forest that had burned triggered me.
Mm-hmm.
It took me back into one of my experiences was driving away from the Black Sands camp, probably about 4 or 5 minutes before it burned, and having to drive through that black, boiling environment with absolutely zero visibility is something that will be a part of my life forever. So self-care. What can we do about self-care? Well, we can do it.
And where do people begin?
Where do people begin? Well, for me, it's always 4 things. Diet, exercise, drink water, take cod liver oil.
Oh, not the cod liver oil.
Yeah, the cod liver oil. Science has shown us that cod liver oil has a really positive effect on our brains.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go through an experience like that, I think it's very important that we protect that wonderful organ that is our brain. And of course, no alcohol and cut back on coffee, but that almost goes without saying. The other thing that I think is really important these days is heart rate variability training. I mentioned that before. And critical, in my opinion, is when we're working with somebody to give them something to take away that provides them relief from the situation that brought them to us. And so I've developed the bells. And the bells are it's just a recording that puts a person into a state that allows them to move their autonomic nervous system back into balance, at least approximating balance, and get some relief from some of the symptoms associated with anxiety. Long term, it has really beneficial qualities to it, like alleviation of anxiety and depression. And there's a lot of research these days from the Association of Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback and leaders like Dr. Laura Lagos that it is really effective for concussion. These are things that we as clinicians should know and we should be working on.
And Len, how can people get a copy of your bells?
How can they get a copy of my bells? Send me an email.
And where do they send that to?
Well, the fast one is firebag2011@gmail.com. And if you send me an email, I'll send it back to you via DropSend. Be happy to do that. Every year I give away 300 to 400 copies of it.
Sounds like a really good place for a lot of folks to start.
You know, I think it is. That's why I did it. Anyway, I think that we've had a wonderful conversation today about grief and loss. We haven't even touched on things about funerals, like why are funerals so important and stuff like that. But we will do this again.
We'll get together again before long. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.